My name is Lisa, and what I'm about to say still gives me the chills. It all started one warm summer night when I came home from work. I work in a small cafe downtown, and we closed late that night. I was exhausted, but the thought of finally relaxing on the sofa with a hot cup of tea in hand gave me strength. As I approached my house, a strange feeling came over me. It seemed that someone was watching me. Looking back, I saw only dark shadows moving under the lanterns. I quickened my pace, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts. The key in the lock turned with a characteristic click, and I entered the apartment. As soon as the door closed behind me, I felt a sense of relief. I took off my jacket and threw it on the chair before going to the kitchen to make some tea. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound like something creaking in another room. The heart began to beat faster. I carefully approached the bedroom door and opened it. It was dark inside, but nothing suspicious was visible. "Lisa, you're just tired," I said to myself and went back to the kitchen. But when I heard that sound again, louder this time, I knew something was wrong. I looked around the room, looking for the source of the sound. My eyes stopped at the window. It was half open, although I definitely remembered closing it before going to work. I went to the window and looked out. The street was empty, but at the same moment, something like a cold breath passed over my skin. I quickly closed the window and locked it. Sitting on the couch with a cup of tea, I tried to calm down, but the feeling that I was being watched did not leave me. The night was quiet, but the silence seemed threatening. That night, I could not sleep. Every sound seemed suspicious and every shadow hostile. I spent the whole night lying in bed, eyes wide open, trying to figure out if it was just a figment of my imagination. The next morning, I decided I needed a distraction. I gathered myself and went to the cafe a little earlier than usual. The day passed in the usual worries: customers, orders, cleaning. But the feeling that someone was watching me did not disappear. In the evening, after the cafe closed, I met my friend Mike. He works in a nearby shop and often comes to our place for coffee after work. I decided to tell him about my suspicions. "Mike, I think I'm being followed," I said, trying not to sound paranoid. He laughed, but then he saw that I was serious. "Lisa, maybe you just thought it, but if it bothers you, let me walk you home today." I nodded gratefully. We walked through the dark streets, and I felt a little more at ease next to Mike. When we got to my house, I invited him in for a cup of tea. He agreed. We sat in the kitchen, laughing and talking. It seemed that my fears were left somewhere behind, but suddenly we heard the same screeching sound as last night. Mike raised his eyebrows and stood up from the table. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, feeling my heart start to race again. We went to the bedroom where the sound came from. Mike carefully opened the door and turned on the light. The room was empty. "But I definitely heard a sound," I said, looking around the room. Mike went to the window and checked the lock. "Everything is closed. Maybe it's just an old building and something is creaking." I sighed and nodded, but at that moment I saw something on the floor near the window. It was a small piece of paper. I picked it up and unfolded it. On the paper was written, "I know where you live." Mike took the paper from my hand and read it. "It's not funny anymore. You need to call the police." I agreed, although I still could not believe that all this was happening to me. Mike stayed the night so I wouldn't be alone. We called the police and they promised to come the next day. The next morning I woke up to someone knocking on the door. They were policemen. They inspected the apartment and took a piece of paper as evidence. They asked me if I had any enemies or anyone who might wish me harm. But I couldn't remember anyone. The policemen said they would keep me posted and left. Mike stayed with me a little longer, but then he had to go to work. I was left alone in an empty apartment, feeling defenseless and scared. It seemed to me that this was only the beginning of something terrible. I could not even imagine how true my fears were. After Mike left, I tried to occupy myself with household chores to keep my mind off what had happened. But every creak of the floor, every sound outside the window made me shudder. I began to doubt that I would be able to stay alone in this apartment. In the evening, I decided to go for a walk to relax a little. I went outside and started walking without a specific route. In the end, I ended up in a park not far from my house. The park was almost empty, and I enjoyed the silence and fresh air. Suddenly, I felt that someone was following me. Looking back, I saw a man in dark clothes who was keeping a distance but was clearly following me. My heart pounded and I quickened my pace. The man also started to walk faster. I decided not to risk it and ran to the exit of the park. When I almost reached the street, the man caught up with me and grabbed my hand. "You lost something," he said, handing me my wallet. I felt relieved and embarrassed at the same time. "Oh, thanks," I said, taking my wallet. "I didn't even notice I lost it." "Don't worry," the man replied. "Just be more careful next time." I nodded and hurried home. Although the man was friendly, my nerves were on edge. At home, I decided it was time to do something more radical. I called my brother Jay, who lived in another city, and asked him to come stay with me for a few days. Jay was my closest relative, and I knew I would feel safer with him. "Lisa, what happened?" he asked, hearing my alarmed voice. I told him everything that had happened in the last few days. Jay immediately agreed to come and said he would be with me the next morning. When I finished the conversation, I heard a soft sound in the corridor again. I slowly walked to the door and saw that the front door was slightly ajar. It was impossible because I always locked them. I froze in place, realizing that someone could have entered the apartment. Armed with a kitchen knife, I carefully went around all the rooms but found no one. The door was intact, but this fact did not reassure me. The next morning, Jay arrived and, seeing me in this state, took control of the situation. He installed a new lock on the door and suggested installing an alarm. We also called the police to report the latest developments. The police promised that they would increase patrols in our area, but I still felt unsafe. Jay stayed with me for a few days, and it took some of the tension away. But when he left, the fear returned. I didn't know what to expect next, and every day became a test for me. And it was then that I began to notice that someone was systematically rummaging through my things, leaving marks that might not have been visible to anyone else, but not to me. My life turned into a series of anxious days and sleepless nights. I began to notice that some things in the apartment were out of place. At first, these were small things. The books that I definitely remembered putting on the shelf ended up on the table. Kitchen appliances appeared in unexpected places. But over time, everything became much worse. One day when I came home from work, I found my phone in the kitchen, although I must have left it on the bedside table in the bedroom. It seemed like a small thing, but I had an unpleasant feeling that someone was in my apartment. I checked all the locks and windows, but found no signs of a break-in. The next day, I noticed that some of my personal belongings were missing. These were old letters, photo cards, and even some jewelry. I called the police and reported it. They checked the apartment again, but found nothing. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. One night, I decided to leave the camera in my bedroom to see if anything strange happened while I was away. The camera was hidden inconspicuously on the shelf, and I was sure that no one would notice it. When I got home and watched the recording, my heart stopped. The video showed someone wearing a mask carefully entering my bedroom, rummaging through my things and then disappearing from the frame. This someone moved so quietly that no sound was heard. I immediately called Mike and told him what I had seen. He came right away and watched the video with me. His face became more and more serious with every second he watched. "Lisa, this is no joke. This someone clearly knows how to stay hidden. We need to take serious action," he said. Mike advised me to move in with him for a while until we could sort out the situation. I agreed, although I did not want to leave my apartment, but the fear for his life won. We packed my essentials and drove to Mike's. His apartment seemed like a fortress compared to mine. He made sure I felt safe and even installed extra locks and cameras. We spent several days watching videos from my apartment and discussing possible actions. Police continued to investigate, but there were no new leads. My life became like a nightmare from which I could not wake up. But one evening, we got a new record. The video showed the same masked man again. He entered the bedroom, but this time he did something strange. He approached the camera, took off his mask, and looking directly into the lens said, "I see you, Lisa, and soon we will see each other in person." My heart stopped. It wasn't just a random burglar. This person knew my name and wanted me to know that he knew me. Mike immediately called the police and they arrived within minutes. But again, they found no trace of the man. They reviewed the tape and began to organize protection for me. But I no longer felt safe, even in Mike's apartment. We spent the next few days in constant anticipation of something terrible. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew it was just the beginning. That man was somewhere nearby, and he wasn't going to stop. Mike and I began seriously preparing for a possible attack. He installed additional cameras and an alarm system in his apartment. The police promised to make frequent patrols in our neighborhood, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closer than it seemed. One evening, as we sat in Mike's living room discussing our plans for the future, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual. However, this feeling did not disappear. "Mike, can you feel it?" I asked, trying to understand if it was just my imagination. He looked at me with concern. "What exactly?" "It's like someone's watching us. I can't shake the feeling," I replied, wrapping my arms around myself as if that would protect me. Mike got up and checked the windows and doors, but everything was closed. He walked over to the camera and checked the live image, but saw nothing suspicious. "Lisa, everything is fine. We are under surveillance and the police will be here soon," he reassured me, although he looked worried himself. We decided to leave the cameras on for the night and went to bed, trying to get some rest. But in the middle of the night, I woke up from a strange sound. It sounded like a soft rustling, like someone crawling in the dark. I carefully got out of bed and approached the bedroom door. Mike also woke up and came to me. "What happened?" he asked in a whisper. "I heard a sound," I replied, pointing to the door. We carefully opened them and went out into the corridor. The sound was getting louder and we went to the kitchen. When we turned on the light, we saw that the locker doors were open and everything was scattered on the floor. But the worst thing was that someone left an inscription on the wall. "You will not hide from me." Mike immediately called the police and they arrived within minutes. They examined the apartment but again found no trace of the burglar. They reviewed the video from the cameras but did not see anything suspicious. It seemed impossible. The police advised us to leave the apartment for a while and move to another place. Mike called his brother, who lived in another city, and he agreed to host us for a few days. We packed things and went to him. The road was long and exhausting, but I felt that the further we moved away from our city, the safer it became for me. We arrived at Mike's brother Jack's place, and he welcomed us with open arms. "Mike, Lisa, don't worry. You'll be safe here," he said as he helped us carry our things into the house. Jack lived in a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town. His house was equipped with a modern security system, and he assured us that no one could break into it without his knowledge. We spent a few days at Jack's house trying to regain composure and find a solution to our problem. But one evening, when we were sitting on the veranda and talking, I suddenly saw something strange. At the edge of the forest near the house, I saw a shadow. She moved slowly, as if watching us. "Mike, look," I whispered, pointing to the woods. He looked away and turned pale. "That's impossible. How did he find us?" Jack also saw the shadow and stood up, taking the phone from the table. "We're calling the police," he said, dialing the number. The police arrived quickly and searched the surrounding area, but again found nothing. I felt that this was no longer just a random burglar. It was someone who knew us, who was playing some horrible game with us. The next morning, we decided it was dangerous to stay in one place. We packed up and left for a new place, but I knew that this story was far from over. We decided to leave Jack's house and move to another place that would remain a secret from everyone. Our friends offered us temporary accommodation in a small cottage a few miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to hide and think about the next steps. On the way, I couldn't get rid of thoughts about how this stranger was finding us. He clearly knew more about us than we knew about him, and that was even more frightening. Mike was by my side and his support kept me in check. We arrived at the cottage and found it to be a cozy place surrounded by dense forests. The absence of neighbors and the difficult accessibility of the place inspired hope that we would be safe here. We settled down and began to think about how to proceed. That evening, while we were sitting in the kitchen, I got a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number, but the content was terrible. "I know where you are." I showed the message to Mike and he squeezed my hand. "Don't worry, we'll deal with it. The police are already dealing with this," he said, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We decided not to inform the police about this message, but to try to find out something ourselves. Mike began gathering information on all the cases that could help us figure out who was behind this. We have also installed additional cameras and an alarm system in the cottage to ensure safety. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace and watched the camera footage, we noticed something strange. One of the videos showed a shadow appearing in the forest. She moved closer to the cottage, but then disappeared from the camera's view. We turned pale, realizing that he had found us again. "Mike, what are we going to do?" I asked, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "We can't hide forever. We need to find him and stop him," he replied, sounding determined. The next morning, we decided that Mike would stay at the cottage, and I would go into town to find out more about the person who was following us. I contacted my friend, Detective John, and asked him for help. He agreed to meet me at a cafe where we could discuss all the details. John was an experienced detective and knew how to act in such situations. I told him everything that happened and showed him the footage from the cameras. He was shocked, but quickly pulled himself together. "Lisa, I'll do everything I can to find this man, but you have to be careful. He obviously knows you're looking for him," John said, looking me straight in the eye. We agreed that John would begin his investigation and I would return to the cottage. He promised to keep me abreast of all developments and to let me know immediately if he found anything important. Back at the cottage, I told Mike about our meeting with John. He looked a little more relaxed, knowing that a professional was handling the matter. That evening, we heard a strange sound from outside again. We went outside and saw that someone had left a note on the doorstep. It was written, "You will not hide from me." That was the last straw. We realized that we needed to act immediately. Mike and I decided to go into the woods and find this man ourselves. We took flashlights with us and headed out into the darkness, ready to face our fear. The forest was thick and dark, and every sound sounded suspicious. We moved carefully, trying not to make any sound. Finally, we saw a shadow moving between the trees. "There he is," Mike whispered, and we began to approach the shadow. But suddenly someone grabbed my hand and pressed me to the ground. Mike tried to help, but he too was knocked down. The shadow above us spoke, "You shouldn't have been looking for me." I felt my heart stop. It was the same man from the video. He leaned toward me and said, "Now you will know what real fear is." Mike tried to fight, but the man was stronger. I realized that our chances of salvation are slim. And at that moment, when it seemed that all was lost, I heard police sirens. John arrived on time. The man tried to run away, but the police quickly apprehended him. They tied him up and took him to the station. Mike and I were saved, but this terrible experience left a deep mark on our minds. John came to us and hugged me. "Lisa, it's over. You're safe now," he said. But I knew I wouldn't be able to forget this nightmare for a long time. The police started an investigation, and we learned that the man was Mike's ex-employee who was getting revenge for his firing. His mental state was unstable, and he decided to scare us to death. We spent the next few weeks trying to get back to normal. Mike and I decided to move to another city and start over. We knew that it would be difficult to forget this horror, but together we could overcome everything. Moving to a new city gave us the opportunity to start from scratch. We found a cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood and hoped that old fears would not find us here. But although we changed our place of residence, our souls remained wounded. The first few weeks were tough. Every sound outside the window, every shadow on the wall caused us anxiety. Mike was working hard trying to distract himself from what he had experienced, and I was trying to find a way to feel safe again. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch talking about our future, Mike suggested seeing a therapist. "Lisa, we need to overcome this fear somehow. Maybe a professional can help us," he said, looking into my eyes. I agreed, and we found a good specialist who helped us understand and process our experiences. But despite this, I still felt that someone was watching us. One day when I was coming home from work, I noticed a stranger standing in our driveway. His face was hidden under a hood, but his figure seemed familiar to me. I quickened my pace, but he did not leave his place, as if he was waiting for someone. When I got to the apartment, I told Mike about it, and he decided to talk to our neighbor, who had installed cameras at the entrance. We looked at the recording and saw that a stranger had been showing up at our front door for several days in a row. Mike called John, our detective friend, and told him about the situation. John promised to come and help us sort it out. He arrived the next day and began his investigation. John advised us not to leave the apartment unless absolutely necessary and not to open the door to strangers. He also installed additional cameras and motion sensors around our apartment. We felt a little more at ease knowing John was there. One evening, while we were sitting at home watching a movie, I heard a knock on the door. Mike went to the door and looked in the window. "It's John," he said as he opened the door. But when he opened the door, it turned out that it wasn't John. The same hooded stranger stood at the door. He pushed Mike back and went into the apartment. I froze in fear, unable to move. "Don't be silly," said the stranger, pulling out a knife from his pocket. "I don't want to hurt you, but I need to know something." Mike stood up and tried to calm him down. "Okay, we hear you. What do you need?" The stranger looked at me and said, "Do you know a man named Richard Howell?" Mike and I looked at each other. This name was unfamiliar to us. "No, we don't know such a person." "What is it about?" Mike asked. The stranger sighed and lowered the knife. "Richard Howell is my brother. He went missing a few months ago. I learned he was last seen with you." Mike and I were stunned. "We don't know your brother, but if you think we can help, we're willing to do whatever we can," I said, trying to understand what was going on. The stranger explained that his brother was a journalist and investigated a series of strange disappearances. He followed the trail of the man who was chasing us, and it led him to our town. He believed that Richard had found something important, but then he disappeared. We decided to help a stranger because it could shed light on our own problems. John also joined us in the investigation. We began gathering information about Richard Howell and his investigation. A few days later, we found Richard's notes that he had left in his office. They contained detailed information about missing persons and a possible suspect. But the scariest part was that we found a photo of our stalker. Now we knew who was behind it all and decided to act immediately. We devised a plan to catch him and hand him over to the police, but as we prepared for it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare wasn't over yet. The feeling of fear and the unknown haunted us every minute. We began to act cautiously so as not to arouse the suspicion of our pursuer. Our team consisted of myself, Mike, John, and a stranger we now knew as Alex, Richard Howell's brother. We devised a plan to trap him using the information Richard had gathered. John suggested that we leave the apartment for a few days and hole up in a motel to give our pursuer the feeling that we had given up the fight. We agreed to this, but left hidden cameras and sensors in the apartment to monitor every movement. We spent a lot of time at the motel discussing our actions and trying to find new tracks. One evening, John received a call from a colleague who said that movement had been detected in our apartment. "Heads over there," John said, looking at us. "Time to act." We quickly got together and went to our apartment. John alerted the police and they were ready to come to help at any moment. When we arrived at the place, we saw that the door of our apartment was open. We entered cautiously, keeping our phones and flashlights at the ready. The living room was dark, but we could hear someone moving in the other room. John motioned for us to be quiet and went to the bedroom door. He opened them with a sharp movement, and we saw our pursuer rummaging through our belongings. "Stand! Police!" John shouted, pointing the flashlight at him. The man froze and raised his hands, but there was a strange smile on his face. "You think it's all that simple?" he said, slowly lowering his hands. Suddenly, he pulled something out of his pocket and threw it in our direction. It was a small device that emitted blinding light and smoke. We were trapped, unable to see anything around us. When the smoke cleared, we saw that the man had disappeared. John rushed to the window and saw his shadow disappearing into the darkness. "He got away, but we'll catch him," John said, calling for help. We knew he wouldn't go far. John and a few police officers gave chase while Mike and I stayed in the apartment to think about our next course of action. Alex sat next to him, holding his head in his hands. "I thought we could stop him," he said with a stifled sigh. Mike put his arms around me and whispered, "We're going to do whatever it takes to put an end to this. We're stronger together." A few hours later, John returned. "We found his hiding place," he said. "He's hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. We're going there immediately." We went with the police to the warehouse. It was dark and cold, and every step echoed in the empty room. We divided into groups and began to search the warehouse. Suddenly, I heard a scream and saw one of the policemen fall to the floor. He was hit from behind. I was scared, but I couldn't allow myself to panic. Mike and John and I continued to push forward. We found him on the second floor of the warehouse. He was standing with his back to us, holding a knife. "This is the end," John said, pointing the gun at him. The man turned and looked at us. "You don't understand that I don't do this for nothing. There are things you better not know," he said, and suddenly rushed at us. John fired and the man fell to the floor. The police quickly ran to him, but he did not move. We stood looking at him and felt mixed emotions, relief and horror. The next day, we learned that this man was involved in a series of disappearances and murders that Richard was investigating. His mental state was unstable, and he believed that in this way he was saving people from a greater threat. The investigation continued, but we knew that now we could start living again without fear. Mike and I decided to stay in our new city and build our lives from scratch. We were grateful to John and Alex for helping us through this nightmare. Although we will never forget those terrible days, we knew that together we could overcome any difficulties. Life goes on, and we were ready to meet it with new hopes and dreams. A few months passed and life began to return to normal. I started working again and Mike got a new job too. We tried to restore our relationship and forget about what happened. But sometimes fear and anxiety still visited us, reminding us of what we had experienced. One morning, while I was having breakfast and watching the news, I became interested in an article about a series of unsolved disappearances in a neighboring state. The article mentioned the name of Richard Howell and his investigation. I felt a chill run down my spine. Mike also noticed the article and approached me. "You should read this," I said, showing him the screen. Mike read the article and frowned. "Maybe it's just a coincidence, but we can't ignore it. John should know about it." We called John and told him about the find. He agreed to meet with us to discuss possible connections between these disappearances and Richard's case. We met in a cafe where we had previously discussed our investigation. John was worried but focused. "This could be an important clue," he said, looking over the paper. "We need to contact the detectives from that state and find out more." A few days later, John informed us that the detectives had agreed to cooperate and sent us copies of the investigation materials. We began to study the documents and look for possible connections. And the more we dug into this matter, the more questions appeared. One evening, while Mike and I were sitting in our apartment, I received an email from an anonymous sender. There was only one sentence in it: "You don't know everything." A file with documents was attached to the letter. Mike and I opened the file and saw some photos and notes. One of the photos showed a man hiding behind a mask. The notes mentioned the names of people who had disappeared and the places where they were last seen. "It looks like a lot more than we thought," Mike said as he looked through the documents. "Maybe it's a whole network." We decided to let John know about this letter and our guesses. He came to us the next day and reviewed the materials. "This is serious," he said with a frown. "We have to be careful and not trust anyone. Maybe it's not just one person, but a whole organization behind it." We began working with detectives from other states to uncover this network. The investigation lasted several months, and each new trail led us to new mysteries. We discovered that many of the missing people were involved in the investigation of corruption and criminal activity in various fields. One day, when we found an important piece of evidence that could shed light on the whole case, someone tried to intimidate us again. We received a note threatening that this time there would be no second chance, but we decided not to give up. John arranged a meeting with a journalist who was willing to tell our story. We knew the truth could be dangerous, but it was the only way we could stop this web and save others. The publication of the article caused a great resonance. The police and the FBI sprung into action, and we felt that justice was finally being served. But the threat still remained. One evening, when we were returning home, I felt that someone was following us. We quickened our pace, but the shadow behind us did not disappear. Suddenly, someone grabbed me by the shoulder and pressed me against the wall. It was the masked man we saw in the photo. "You made a big mistake by going public with all this," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "Now you will reap the consequences." Mike tried to intervene, but the man was stronger. He punched Mike and knocked him to the ground. I could feel the fear paralyzing me, but I couldn't allow myself to give up. I pushed my husband away with all my might and rushed to Mike. That evening, we realized that the threat had not yet passed, but we also knew we had to keep fighting. The truth was on our side, and we could not back down. We knew it was time to end this story once and for all. After the attack on us, Mike and John and I joined forces to gather enough evidence to find the leader of this criminal network. We spent the last few days in a thorough analysis of all the documents and materials we received. Finally, we discovered that all threads lead to one person, an influential businessman who was involved in corruption and human trafficking. We gathered all the information and passed it on to the police and the FBI. They organized a special operation to arrest him and everyone involved in this network. Mike and John and I traveled with them to witness the final stage. The special operation was successful. The businessman and his accomplices were detained. Finally, the truth came out and all their crimes became public knowledge. After that, we felt we could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The criminal network was destroyed and we could return to normal life. Mike and I decided to move to another city, away from all these terrible events, and start a new chapter in our lives. John remained our friend and kept in touch. This story taught us that even in the darkest times, one cannot lose hope and faith in justice. We went through a lot of fear and pain, but in the end, we came out victorious. And now we knew that together we can overcome any difficulties.